Hi there, welcome to this week's video. Sorry it's a bit later than usual. As I say, I had a couple of problems in the week. Mainly I sort of sprained my ankle, which meant I was a bit out of action. But I did manage to get up there on the Thursday and film this. So here we are. So we're revisiting, this is the same scene that I painted last week. This is Southwold in Suffolk. And last week, if you remember, I'll put a link or you can find it on my channel. I did the painting in the style of the Dutch landscape painters. So the emphasis was tonal, and I was particularly interested in, muted colours, not much in terms of like visible brush strokes, certainly not compared to the Impressionists. And overall a very different mood and atmosphere to this painting that I did today. So in my tutorial on Monday, we had a look at the Impressionists, and I talked about some of the main sort of features that distinguish them from that Dutch approach. So specifically that they were much more interested in colour as opposed to tone. So although there are tonal values here, we see the range, the tonal range is diminished. So instead of going from white to black, the lightest light is going to be sort of, in this case, probably a pale yellow, and the darkest darks, blues and purples, not using black. In fact, when I started the painting, I put out burnt umber, as I usually do on my palette, as a sort of greying colour, but in the end I decided not to use that. Well, I don't think I used it very much anyway. So trying to keep the colours bright. And the other thing is, as well as keeping the colours bright, I also made the effort to try to keep my brush strokes quite distinct. So thinking more in terms of tiles, little slabs of colour. But before I put those slabs on, as you can see right now, I'm basically sketching out the scene, just trying to get the general construction of the painting established before going on with some bigger chunks. So here we are, and I really did. The main thing I was thinking with this painting is, to try and keep it lively, to have fun, and just sort of see how these little squares behave beside each other. So as you can see, I was going for the approach of mixing colour and then doing a few strokes before going back to the palette. Again, just taking a sort of quite intuitive approach. But my idea wasn't to, so this field that I'm painting here was just caught by the evening sun, which is why we can see these, it goes slightly towards the pink in the lights, and we get bluer notes in the shadow. But as tempting as it was, I was trying not to mix those colours first, but I was trying to use combinations of warm and cool, orange and blue, green and red, and just try and put interesting colours side by side and trust on this, the effect of optical mixing. So this is where the brain interprets all these different coloured chunks and basically mixes them. But you get very nice effects, and I enjoyed painting it, and it sort of opened up some possibilities. So when we put the complementaries beside each other, so in this case, for example, orange and blue, or pinks and turquoises and these sorts of things, they not only do they optically mix, but they also have the effect of complementaries basically reinforce each other. So there's an exercise you can do actually, which just sort of gives you some insight into the power of complementary colours. And you basically take a, say for example, you take a red sort of square, a bit of red paper cut into a square, and you put it on a white table, and if you stare at it, you stare at it and stare at it until your eyes start to water. And what will happen is that red square will start to shimmer as your eyes, it's basically at the back of the eye. It's almost like you're fatiguing the part of your brain that sees red. And then what you do is you suddenly whip away the red square, and if you stare down at the white table, you will get an after image of green. Okay, so it's like when the eye is fatigued with red, it sees green. Okay, and that gives you a little bit of a clue as to how these things work. So the other thing is, if you take a grey and surround it with green, that grey starts to look more red. Okay, and it's to do with the way the back of your eye, the cones are sort of interacting. So now that's a grey. So if everything that's surrounded by orange looks a bit blue, well, you can imagine if you put blue surrounded by orange, then it looks blue, but times, times 10 or whatever. It's amplifies its blueness. But that also then influences the orange, because the blue is surrounding the orange or influencing the orange and making that look more orange. And it's that play of colour side by side that creates the effect of colours seeming to glow and shimmer. Again, it's like looking at that red square. It sort of affects the way you perceive. And the Impressionists, they sort of were stumbling across this stuff intuitively in their painting, and then also later with the Pointillists, you can see they really started to refine some of the sort of science behind it and try to turn it into a sort of art movement. So it's not unlike the same thing they do in printing. In the print, as I say, in magazines, they print just with primary colours: magenta, cyan, yellow, I think, and black, and obviously white as the page. And in that combination, they create all the colours that you could want. So there was an idea you could do that in painting, but it was sort of short-lived. It was a sort of nice idea, but people didn't really stick with it. But other you can still see artists exploiting the same effects today. Certainly with acrylic painters, if any of you know Hashim Akib, he's a good example of a sort of contemporary painter, and he paints quite large, discrete brushstrokes in acrylics, and he allows those colours to sort of vibrate against each other. And it's a technique that works really well with acrylics, because every sort of medium has its own strengths and weaknesses, and with acrylics, the strengths are often the brightness of colour. Okay, you can get very strong, intense pigments. Its weaknesses compared to oils is it doesn't blend so well. The colours don't seem to interact, in my experience, quite as nicely, and also you can't merge and perhaps get the same nice sort of soft edges that you can do with oil paints. Oil paints, you can do quite a lot of work once the paint's on the canvas, and I found with acrylics, because they dry quickly, you can't really do a great deal of fiddling. But as you can see, this approach, this more impressionist approach, isn't requiring much fiddling. You're just simply laying down these colours. So you can see the colours I found for the sky were largely done by just sort of half squinting my eyes and just sort of playing around. I think the main ideas were, the sky is quite grey, but instead of mixing a grey, I thought, well, I've got some pink and some yellow and some blue in there, and just trying to play around with those to sort of somewhat mimic the effects that I could see happening. So we had a little bit of a fast forward there, but you can see I did a little bit more. There's a bit more work in the foreground. There's that nice sort of bluish shadow in the foreground, which helps to pick up some of the blue from the sky as well. So now I'm going into the darks of the horizon. And although it's very tempting to, I mean, I do go quite dark, but I still try to keep these darks full of colour. So not sort of umber and not sort of over mixing them, but using things like the red and the blue, and trying to create a certain rhythm. Obviously this is speeded up. I think the painting took me, you know, over an hour or so, but I tried to keep the whole thing moving at a brisk pace, and also that's somewhat thinking of the Impressionists. When you think of Impressionist painting, you think of someone, you know, out in nature, standing back from their canvas, working quite quickly, fluidly, and creating these almost sketches of nature. The Dutch paintings, you can imagine people, you know, leaning over a canvas and, you know, with a very, very fine brush, sort of painting each leaf. So they have very different sort of flavours or moods to them. And you, when you're painting and you're trying to sort of understand a sort of genre of painting, you need to be aware of all these other things that might be feeding into the way the paintings look. So these were some little bushes in the distance, so just trying to create little highlights there. And there's something really pleasing about working with the paint in this sort of almost spotty approach, because it's really quite interesting. You know, you're still painting, and your understanding of form and how the light's hitting the objects, that's all the same, but with the spotty approach you're basically allowing the viewer to the sort of the viewer's brain to do a lot of the work. You're just sort of suggesting notes and colour and allowing the viewer to fill in the details, so it's quite fun in that respect. So one of the things, this optical mixing, to come back to that, because I'm somewhat ahead of my, well, I'm behind in my schedule this week, so I've looked at some of the work I've been handed in. I think it's really important to grasp the fact that the colours here, because you're doing optical mixing, it's not a literal interpretation of colour. So it's not a case of the field's green, therefore I need to paint it green. So sure, I can put in green pigment, but I can also put in reds, and the reds aren't literal, but they're there to sort of complement the greens, for example. Or in areas where I've got oranges, I put little dabs of blue, say, okay? And so it is sort of taking you somewhat away from that literal interpretation, and I think that can be a sort of that can be a bit of a leap for some people that like to paint as they see it. Because we can see that what happened as the experimentation with colour unfolded under the Impressionists, it eventually led to things like Fauvism and Expressionism, where colour became, well, really liberated from what was out there in the world, and became much more about the emotional impact on the viewer. So talk about symbolic colour. So you're painting things, you know, bit red skies, and you know, if you think of Van Gogh, his colour also, although it might have had one foot in the actual observed world, he was also starting to play around with colour again to just create effects, moods, emotions, and that's where this approach eventually led. As some of you may know, some of the things that they became interested in art, what we think of as like modern art, where it broke away from sort of representational art, is you know, Picasso famously became very interested in masks and artifacts from Africa. You know, this was the sort of, when are we thinking? I guess this is towards the end of like, you know, we think of the age of empires and sort of colonies and this sort of thing. But there was a great interest in the East and exotic cultures, and museums had become a thing, and they were full of these things. And so Picasso was looking at these African masks, and he was noticing that there was something uh, very sort of visceral in the response to them. So even though they were non-representational, there was still something that communicated to us without that sort of need for literalism. And so that sort of took him into this. He started to get interested in, like, they call it primitivism, and you know, drawing. He did Mademoiselle d'Avignon, which is a famous painting, and the faces of the women in it, they look a bit like African masks. I mean, they're very sort of strange, and it's not what you'd call aesthetically pleasing. So it's quite a shocking piece. But it was all like, and so it sort of got people interested in art really as a way to evoke emotional response. So you no longer had to be tied to painting things as you saw them. And then also they started to look at the art of children, or people that were sort of in like psychiatric hospitals, or also naive artists, you know, artists that had never had any formal training. And so all these things were in the mix, and it all contributed to this move away from the idea that art had to sort of be some sort of objective record of reality. It became much more sort of open than that, and eventually led to, you know, the more sort of difficult modern art we might think of, like Marcel Duchamp and the urinal and that sort of thing. But yeah, it's an interesting journey, and I mean, I only know parts of the puzzle, and you know, you pick up bits here and there, but you can sort of see, the, you know, the beginnings of it even in Impressionism. Um, and of course, for us, you know, these days we have all this art history, and so, you know, we're not following it in a linear style. We have to really just sort of think about what's the art that speaks to us and responds to us, that we sort of, you know, we like. Um, and personally, I like the Impressionists, and I like sort of representational art. I think there's something, you know, I like Edward Seago, and I like, you know, Edward Seago is a good example. I mean, his figures and they are almost expressionist, because he was working very quickly and sort of dashing things out. And also you can see that with Impressionism, working outdoors and working quickly led to this more sort of spontaneous approach. But yet it's still got one foot in the world of representation. So yeah. But I say, these days you could take any of these themes and go as far as you wanted in any direction, really, and that's sort of a great freedom. But it's also, we're almost spoilt for choice. It can be sort of difficult to know where to start. So I like the idea in my classes, really, of just, people need to start enjoying art and then build up the foundation in terms of, you almost have to go through the process yourself. I don't think it's good just to start with, say, like the Fauvists or Expressionism, and just sort of anything goes, and just putting down colour and not really worrying about drawing or anything of these things. So I think it's best to build your foundation with your observational work. And then as you develop as an artist, you are going to, you know, have lots of influences. You're going to try different things out. You're also going to be very affected by your context. So living in Ipswich, for example, is quite different than if I was living in London. If you had access, because we don't work completely in isolation. Even people that come to my classes are often showing their work to friends and family, and that almost becomes their context. I got a chap, Steve, comes to my Monday class, and he'll often bring in work because his wife's not happy with a particular aspect of it, and he needs to do a bit more work before it can go on the wall. And as it happens, like lots of artists have had that relationship with their critics, as it were. So I think that film on Jackson Pollock, he had that. I can't remember his name now. There was a sort of famous art critic who sort of championed him at the beginning of his career. And Jackson Pollock was sort of making these great big paintings, sort of splashing paint around. And this guy said, this is genius. This is amazing stuff. There's something in this. These paintings, they've got a certain something. You can't put your finger on it, but there's something amazing about them. Unfortunately, later in his career, he also then said that the paintings no longer had it. And unfortunately, it was rather somewhat out of Jackson Pollock's hands, because in a way, the success and failure of his work was being determined by someone else, not himself. So you have to be very careful about that. Anyway, I hope that's not too much of a digression. But yeah, the main thing is you have to be aware of your context, but also do the work you enjoy. I think that's the base. That's the safest thing, and push yourself to improve. So here we are. As you see, the colours sort of balance quite nicely, just using the primary colours, French ultramarine, rose for my red, and just a Windsor yellow and white. So there's a harmony here, but I hope you can see there's some of that colour vibration coming in. So yeah, I really enjoyed that, and I'm hoping to do a few more Impressionist pieces over the summer. And still hoping to get out there. Anyway, I think that's about that. So here comes the final painting, which I took home and photographed. Okay, so there we go. So as you can see, it's a bit brighter there. But hopefully you can see some of the main points I was trying to communicate. Lots of discrete chunks of colour, not too much blending, allowing the colours to sort of work on their own, and the sort of vibration that comes from putting complementaries, greens, reds, pinks, purples, putting colours side by side and seeing the effects they create. So I hope that's of some use and might give you some inspiration for having a go at your own Impressionist painting. If you do, leave me a comment, send me a picture. I'm always interested to see people's work. And I'll be here same time next week for another demo. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching. Cheers. Bye.